Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is the scoop on snakes, and it will be presented by our fabulous expedition leader, Scott Gibson. Scott, thank you so much for being here today and bringing us this fascinating topic. I'll turn it right over to you.
Awesome, thank you, I appreciate it. Well, welcome everybody, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to my talk today. I am unfortunately getting over COVID and have been downing cough drops left and right, so I apologize if you hear me chomping on one during the presentation or I start coughing. This is a topic I really enjoy talking about, and I'll kind of give you a little brief introduction to kind of who I am here. So I'm Scott Gibson, and I am a wildlife biologist with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. In my current position, I'm a non-game biologist, so I work with animals that are not hunted here in the state of Utah, and I'm primarily over mammals and birds. But I also am kind of the de facto herpetologist for the southeastern region of the state. And the reason that I am is because I have a pretty extensive background in doing both work with and research on snakes, especially rattlesnakes. So I did my graduate research quite a while ago on timber rattlesnakes in the Midwest, and then I did some postgraduate work on eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes. And I worked for the National Audubon Society in California, not as a bird biologist, but as sort of the non-bird biologist, and spent a lot of time doing work on snakes there. So I have a fairly extensive background on working with all kinds of reptiles and amphibians, but snakes are definitely my passion and what I enjoy talking about the most. So if you do have questions, please definitely type them in. I would love to I'll try and leave enough time at the end, and I'll monitor my time as we go. But let's just kind of jump right into it as we get going. And I wanted to give this topic because I feel that snakes are probably one of the most misunderstood groups of animals on the planet. There's a lot of misconceptions, there's a lot of fear. People see them from time to time, but for the most part, they're fairly secretive. And when they do see snakes, people are generally pretty startled about it. So I'm hoping today to, at least, if I don't change people's minds, if you have a negative view, if I don't change your mind on snakes, at least to give you a new appreciation for them. So there's about 3,000 species of snakes worldwide, and they're found in every continent except for Antarctica. And they're found pretty much in every biome. So there's snakes that are in the ocean, there's tropical snakes, there's desert snakes, there's temperate forest snakes. Obviously, the closer you get to the equator, the more snake species you're gonna have, and the further away you get, the fewer. But they are found in almost every environment on the planet. And they are tetrapods, so they're grouped in with animals that have 4 legs, and there are still some snakes out there that have residual vestigial limbs closer to the base of the tail. So through the process of evolution, snakes have evolved to not have those 4 limbs. But one thing that is kind of interesting is that they do have the bulk of the same general internal anatomy as most tetrapods. And so on the screen, there should be a picture of the internal anatomy of the snake. And you'll notice that a lot of the organs are pretty much the same. It's just everything is elongated and sausaged and crammed into a tubular body. But there are a few differences. And so one of the main differences, most snakes have a greatly reduced left lung, and the right lung extends about halfway down the length of the body. Again, not all snakes have that, but quite a few do. Snakes do not have a urinary bladder. So they produce uric acid as their primary method of excreting waste. And the reason for that is that because snakes are oftentimes found in dry environments, it's a way of conserving water. And that comes out of one opening like birds have, because reptiles and birds are very closely related, called a cloaca. And the cloaca on this diagram would be just about where we're pointing at the anal scale and where it says hemipenis. And that's actually another interesting thing about snakes, and that's that male snakes and lizards, because lizards are grouped in with snakes and what are called squamates, have actually 2 penises. So they have 2 reproductive organs called hemipenes. And here's a picture of them. And you can see that they are kind of these spiky little bulbous organs that are right at the base of the tail. And males will have those obviously, and females will not. And that's one of the ways that you can actually tell a female from a male snake externally if you have one of each in the hand, and that's everything kind of below the cloaca is going to be the tail. And if you have a male snake, the hemipenes will be located in the tail. And so the tail oftentimes doesn't have much of a taper post cloaca, and the tail is generally longer to house those hemipenes, and you won't have that in female snakes. So there's a lot of overlap in the anatomy of snakes as well as most four-legged animals on the planet, but there are those differences. And then you do have, of course, everyone's familiar with the external scales on the outside, and scales are basically keratin, same thing as your hair and your fingernails, and they're not plates that are basically like put down on the snake. They are actually folds in the skin, and the bigger the fold, the thicker the folds form those scales on the outside. I like to usually do, if I had a camera on me, I'd hold a piece of paper up and kind of fold the paper a little bit, make a wave in the paper and bend it over. And that would kind of show you how those folds make those scales. And the reason I bring that up is when the snake sheds, there is actually skin between those scales, and those scales are going to pull apart and there's going to be skin between them. So when you do find a shed skin of a snake, you're actually finding it, it's considerably longer than the snake would actually be, because the sort of those interstitial spaces between the scales are going to spread out and you're going to have skin between there. So let's talk a little bit about some scale modifications on snakes and just kind of go over these real quickly, because there's a lot of variability within these. And again, these are keratin, so all these scales that you see on here are the same protein as our hair and our fingernails. In the upper left corner, you have a gaboon viper, and then below that, you have a rhinoceros viper. And both of those species have these enlarged rostral scales above the nose, or nasal scales. The function of those is up for debate, but you can see they're kind of an interesting scale modification. In the upper right, you have a patch nose snake, and that has, you see that it has a kind of a shovel-shaped or a spade-shaped scale on the front of its nose, and they actually can push down into soft sandy soil. They're one of the few snakes that will actually, they're not really fossorial in that they don't dig, but they will actually kind of push down into soft sandy soil. Most snakes don't do that. And then, of course, I think the best scale modification, because I'm biased, in the lower right corner, you have the rattlesnake, and you can see the scales on make up those rattles. And it's interesting to note that, because one of the real common misconceptions with rattlesnakes is that they will add a scale segment every time they shed. And that's, or I'm sorry, once a year, I apologize. But the reality is they add it every time they shed. And so you can't actually determine the age of a rattlesnake based upon the rattle segments, but you can, as long as you have a complete rattle string, and you often don't because they break off as the snake moves around, you're able to tell how often the snake sheds. And if you have a shedding rate and you know that they shed X number of times per year, then you can kind of calculate age. The problem with that is it's variable. Young snakes, when they're growing faster, will shed more often than older snakes. And this is a picture of a young rhinoceros viper. And the reason I put this picture in here is this snake shows something that a lot of snakes exhibit, and that is changes in coloration as they get older. And so this is a juvenile, and you can see it's very brightly colored. As they get older, they deposit melanin into the skin. And so this is the same snake species, and you can see it's considerably darker. The pattern's a lot more washed out. And again, that's the result of melanin being deposited across the skin. And then this is just another example of a snake here in the United States. This is an eastern racer, or a black racer. And you can see the juvenile in the upper right corner has a real strong pattern. And as it gets older, it deposits melanin in there, and you can't see it, that pattern. And then I just put this in here. These are timber rattlesnakes, and these are all ones that were in my study when I did my graduate work. And I just put this in here because most adult snakes generally show the same color pattern when they get older, but rattlesnakes especially are ones where you do get a lot of different color phases. So you can see there's bright yellow kind of in the lower right corner. There's ones that are almost black. There's ones that are brown and gray and yellow and pretty much every color in between. So kind of a neat snake in that they do that. But I think the one that is probably the neatest in the world in terms of having multiple color phases is an adult. If anybody's been to Costa Rica, you may have seen these, or Central America. This is an eyelash pit viper. And they, in the same kind of brood of young can have multiple color phases. And the one in the upper left is a bright yellow one, and the one in the lower right is much more camouflaged. And the interesting thing about this is that it actually can dictate the ecology of these snakes. So the yellow ones are going to tend to forage more around flowers and actually hunt things like hummingbirds, whereas in the lower right, it's going to be going more for rodents and lizards that are hunting along branches where it can be an ambush predator that way. And I mentioned shedding, and shedding, the term for that in reptiles is called ecdysis. And most people are aware that snakes will shed their skin in one piece, and lizards, on the other hand, usually don't. There are some lizard species that do. If you're from California or you're further west, sometimes you may see alligator lizards. They tend to shed their skin all in one piece, but for the most part, snakes don't shed their skin in pieces if they're healthy. They shed them all in one chunk. And the way that this works is, you can see that picture on the left-hand side. You have the head scales are starting to come off, and what a snake will do is it will actually rub those the rostral scale or the nasal scale on something rough like a rock, and that will cause those scales to free up. And then as it begins to move forward, if it can get some friction on that skin, it will tend to pry up. And you can see in the upper right corner, what ends up happening, it's almost like taking off a sock. It peels off, and what you are left with usually then is is an inside out skin, because it is peeling off like a sock there. And the other interesting thing that's to note there is that you can see the eye cap or the eye scale. Snakes have no eyelids. And so you can see that there is an eye cap or a scale that goes over that. And then in the lower right, you see a snake there that has very cloudy eyes. And what's going on there, and you may hear people talk about that snakes that are getting ready to shed have blue eyes or cloudy eyes. And the reason for that is they actually lose water from the body. And in between the body and the outer layer of skin, there'll be a layer of water that will help loosen that skin. And that causes that blue or cloudy eye part. Some people think snakes are a little more defensive or aggressive at that stage, and I guess they probably are, but they're usually fairly hidden. So actually finding a snake that's getting ready to shed can be a little more difficult. So when you look at a snake or you think about a snake, it's kind of interesting to think about what senses snakes would have that they would use to kind of navigate around their environment. And it helps to think about this in terms of, having no legs and 95% of your body surface in contact with the ground at all times. And so things that are going to be really important to a snake are not necessarily hearing. And I start with this one because this is another misconception about snakes. A lot of people think that snakes are deaf because they don't have any external ears. I'll go back and you can see on this picture of a gopher snake, which is one of the more common Western snakes, you can see there are no external ear openings behind the eye. You can see the nostril openings in front of the eye, but nothing behind there. So they have no external ears. But they do actually have the same internal inner ear bones that we have, or other animals with external ears do have. But some of those bones are actually connected to a bone called the quadrate bone. And so what that does is they actually pick up vibrations. So that body is in constant contact with the ground, and it's a really good transmitter of vibrations. And so snakes can actually hear airborne sounds, but very low frequency sounds that cause vibrations. Humans, I think, can hear about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, and snakes can probably hear sounds that are considerably lower than that, probably more in the 50, or I'm sorry, in the 10 to the 1,000 hertz range. So they can hear much lower sounds than we can, but they are especially sensitive to ground vibrations. So any vibration on the ground is going to be picked up by those inner ear bones, or the quadrate bones, and then transmitted to the inner ear bones. They can probably process it into sound. Doesn't mean that walking down a trail and shouting, if you're familiar with bear country and you walk around shouting, "Hey bear," it's probably not going to have the same effect with snakes, but there's a good chance they will be able to pick up and feel those vibrations in the ground. Sight is kind of all over the board with snakes. In some snake species, like the upper left where you have a green mamba from Africa, There are arboreal snakes that tend to climb trees, and those snakes have very well-defined eyesight. And so they can navigate around very complex environments using sight, and they are definitely sight predators. And then you have a worm snake in the lower right corner there, and you can see that the eyes are greatly reduced, and they are behind some very heavy caps. These are snakes that will kind of push down into very soft soil and tend to be a little more fossorial, kind of like I mentioned with the patch nose snake earlier on. And so there's a wide range of sight. And I usually don't talk a whole lot about sight because it is so variable. But the one thing that is kind of interesting, and you can make some generalizations about snakes and their activity patterns based on the shape of the pupil. And you can see that the snake in the upper left, again, that green mamba, has a round pupil. And these are generally diurnal snakes, or snakes that are active in the daytime. And they have these round pupils that allow them to gather a lot of light and be able to navigate around. But snakes that tend to be nocturnal or tend to be what we call facultatively nocturnal. So snakes that may shift their activity pattern when it gets hot. So they might be active in the daytime when it's cooler, and then active at night when it gets to be a little bit hotter. They tend to have very slit-like pupils or elliptical pupils, like a cat. And the reason for that is they need to protect those sensitive rod cells in their eyes that are going to help them navigate at night. And so they need to be able to reduce down that pupil shape. And so it's not a hard and fast rule, but it is definitely something that we can look at and say that it, there are generalized patterns about the shape of a snake's pupil. And you may hear too that in the United States that snakes with vertical pupils are venomous, snakes with round pupils are not. Generally, that's true, although we do have some non-venomous snakes with vertical pupils, and coral snakes have round pupils. So don't go off that. As I mentioned, there's a large surface area in contact with the ground, and so touch is going to be very important to snakes. You may, if you've ever held a snake, you know that they have very their skin feels very tough. It's not slimy at all. It's not wet because it does have those keratin scales on the outside, but they are those scales in the skin are richly supplied with tactile receptors. So they're very responsive to touch and vibration in the ground. So this is a very important sense. One sense that we may not think about, but is very important in a couple of different groups of snakes, is this idea of heat or thermal radiation. And on the left-hand side, we have a timber rattlesnake. And if you notice, just kind of down below and to the left of the eye, you'll see a hole in the face there. It's actually not the nostril. That's something called a facial pit. And you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's a python or a boa over there. And on the lip scales, or the scales just below the mouth, you'll see that there are those labial pits in there. There are, I think you can see about 5 or 6 on that snake. Both of those pits and both of those species that you can see on the screen will actually pick up thermal radiation. And so rattlesnakes and pit vipers, which is where pit vipers get that name from that facial pit, are much more evolved in their ability to do this than the boids and the pythons, but they both have an ability to pick up that heat. They've actually done some experiments to look at this where they actually can block the facial pit, and the snake really is not, and put a blindfold on the snake, and the snake's not really able to effectively find prey and strike at prey. But if they, even with a blindfolded snake, if they remove those cotton balls or the swabs from the facial pits, the snake is able to detect that thermal image and actually strike out and find prey. So heat, the ability to detect heat is very important in these animals. And you can imagine then that these would be animals that primarily target warm-blooded animals like birds and small mammals and things like that. And by and large they do, although there are definitely ones that eat other snakes and other lizards and reptiles, but they have that ability to detect heat. But that's a very specialized sense in a lot of snakes, but one sense that is very universal is this idea of chemosensing. And a lot of people think that snakes smell with their tongue. And that's partially true, but it's not 100% true. They actually do have nostrils, and they have olfactory receptors within their nostrils that allow them to pick up scents that way. What the tongue is doing, though, is it's actually will stick their tongue out, and the tongue is forked probably for a couple of different reasons. One is it increases surface area to pick up those chemical scent molecules in the air. And also, when it's forked like that, it gives it better directionality to pick up those scents. So if you have a rabbit that is 10 feet to the left of the snake and it sticks out its tongue, and that rabbit is producing chemical molecules that have a particular odor, the left side of the tongue is going to pick them up at a rate that is more rapid or sooner than they are on the right-hand side. And what the snake will do then is pull that tongue into its mouth, and there's an organ on the top of the mouth called the Jacobson's organ, and the snake will then press the tongue into the Jacobson's organ, and that's basically like a supercomputer that's able to then sort of analyze the chemical scents that are on the tongue. And so this is something that is universal to snakes, and lizards have it as well, although not all lizards have forked tongues, but they have the ability to do this. And some mammals have modified Jacobson's organs as well. Cats do, horses do. There's quite a few animals that have this, but in snakes, it's very well defined, and it's very important for finding prey and also for finding mates. And so definitely one of the more important senses that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us because we don't have that ability to do it. Although they do, some humans do have residual or kind of vestigial Jacobson's organs in the roof of their mouth, but they're not really connected to any nerve endings anymore, so they're not functional, but kind of interesting to know. And I mentioned that snakes with those facial pits are going to probably be targeting warm-blooded animals, but we know that snakes are what we call cold-blooded or ectotherms. I do hear from time to time people refer to snakes as exotherms. For the record, exotherm means that you give off heat, and so that would be like an explosion of the exothermic. And unfortunately, snakes are not exothermic. It'd be pretty sweet if they were, but they are not, but they are ectotherms. And what that means is that if you're a cold-blooded ectothermic animal, you don't produce enough excess metabolism or heat from metabolic processes to sustain high temperatures. You may generate a little bit, but by and large, your body temperature is going to mirror the ambient conditions. Endotherms, so things like birds and mammals, they do have enough heat through their metabolic processes to sustain high temperatures. Like humans, we maintain a temperature between 97 and 99 on a regular basis, and that's due to our metabolic processes. The downside of that is we have to burn about 10 times as much energy as a snake, and some endotherms have to burn a lot more than that. Things like hummingbirds and shrews that have very high metabolism, and so it's very energetically expensive to maintain to be an endotherm. Whereas if you're an ectotherm, you can eat a lot less because you don't have to maintain those metabolic processes. But the downside is you're also generally inactive in cold temperatures. There are certainly ectotherms that are more active in cold temperatures. Wood frogs, for example, are amphibians that can actually freeze solid and can be active in very cold temperatures at times. But for the most part, you're generally inactive in cold temperatures. And the other, not necessarily downside, but just the reality of being an ectotherm is that your temperature controls your bodily functions. And what I mean by that is in order to be able to digest food, things like that, you have to have a temperature that will allow that to happen. And so if you were to feed a snake a rodent and then put it in a refrigerator, it probably wouldn't be able to have the bodily function to do the digestion processes that it would need to do. So it may have to regurgitate the mouse. But there's definitely some trade-offs to being an ectotherm, and some of them are positives and some of them are negatives. It doesn't, however, mean that snakes are just out there in the environment and their body temperature is fluctuating wildly all over the place. They control their body temperature behaviorally. So it's behavioral thermoregulation is what we call that. And basically what that means is a snake, when it's cold, is going to bask in the sun and find a warmer spot. And when it's hot, because most snakes, or probably all snakes, have a preferred temperature for their body to function properly. It's wider in some species than it would be in others, but when they get a little bit warmer, they're going to back up into the shade. And I took that picture of a black rat snake on the top where I watched it for probably 10, 20 minutes where it had half of its body sort of in the shade and half of its body out in the sun. And what it would do is it would move more or less of its body in and out of that those different conditions, depending on if it was cold or warm. And it did actually have a bulge in its belly that had eaten something fairly recently, so it was probably trying to elevate its body temperature to aid in digestion. Picture below that is a timber rattlesnake, and rattlesnakes, all rattlesnakes, are give birth to live young, and a lot of people don't know about that. We'll talk about reproduction here in a minute, but this was a gravid or a pregnant female, and she was extending her tail out from underneath the vegetation in order to get more sunlight to help those developing embryos stay warm. And we'll talk about some of the advantages of that in a minute. But let's talk really quickly about diet and also foraging. So what they're eating and then how they procure that food. And a lot of people know that snakes have the ability to consume prey that's considerably bigger than you would expect for the size of its head. And the reason that they're able to do this is all kind of tied into the morphology of their skull. So, excuse me, snakes have, just like we do, have something called the quadrate bone. But in humans and most other animals, the quadrate bone is fused into the skull, and it's not mobile. And the quadrate bone is shown here in orange in this picture. And the quadrate bones in snakes is it's not fused. And it allows, what it does is it sort of allows the lower jaws or the lower mandibles to be able to have a much wider gape. And so they can swing outward, and they allow those mandibles to go down even further. And then the other thing is in humans and most animals, we have what's called a mandibular symphysis that connects our mandibles, connects our jaws, so our jaws cannot spread. Snakes don't have the same type of mandibular symphysis that we would. They have a very loose ligament there in the front. So not only can a snake, I kind of like to use an analogy to, if you sort of lock your fists in front of you and hold your arms out, if you are a snake, and if that's the circle that's created between your fists and your chest, if you're a snake and your elbows are sticking way out, that's the gape that a snake would have. Whereas if you were a lizard or a snake that didn't have those quadrate bones that were mobile and your mandibles weren't, you kind of lock your elbows into your side and you look down and there's kind of a triangular gape now. It's much smaller. So that's why snakes are able to eat prey that are considerably bigger than most other animals can. And these are just some examples. This is an egg-eating snake from Africa, and you can see it's considerably larger than the head. And what they would do is actually go in there and crush the shell and then spit the shell back out and consume the contents. This is a California king snake, and it was eating a gopher snake. I took this picture in California when I worked out there. And the gopher snake was much larger than the California king snake. It ended up having to regurgitate the gopher snake. And you can see on the lower right, the gopher snake actually had a huge bulge in its belly. So it had recently eaten as well. And the gopher snake was dead at this point because it had been suffocated. And we kind of toothpasted, that's what you call it when you sort of pushed out the gut contents of the snake. And it was a huge gopher in there. And the gopher weighed almost as much as the snake. And then this is a speckled rattlesnake eating a fence lizard. And you can see the fence lizard is bright blue. And the reason for that is it has what are called chromatophores on the back, which are these color pigment cells on there that can open when it's in distress. And clearly it's going to be in distress as this snake is eating it. But these are all really great examples of consuming prey considerably larger than you would expect given the body size. And then there's kind of a few different ways that snakes will procure their food, and we call the act of doing that foraging. And some snakes are what we call active foragers. This is a black racer, and this is a snake that will constantly go out and be searching for its food and actively moving around. And there's a lot of snakes like this. Gopher snakes do this, racers and black rat snakes, and quite a few snakes, especially thinner bodied snakes, tend to have this mode of foraging. The sort of the flip side of that, and most rattlesnakes and heavy bodied snakes in the world, so pythons and boas and a lot of snakes like that, tend to do what we call sit and wait foraging. And this is where they will use their tongue, they'll chemosense, they'll stick their tongue out and they'll pick up scent trails and find the place where their prey. In this case, here's a picture of a really large timber rattlesnake. This guy was a beast. He was almost 7 feet long. He was the biggest snake I had in the study. And you can see it sitting here with its head resting on a log, and it's waiting for a squirrel to go running by, and then it would strike at the squirrel at that point, and then allow that squirrel to run off, and the squirrel would die. And then what it would do is it would use it would chemosense to its own venom. They have the ability to do that because you don't want to just pick up the scent trail of any squirrel or any rodent that's out there, because there'd be quite a few of them. So again, this is what we call sit and wait. And then we have sort of a third mode that's a little different. It's a little more like sit and wait than anything, but there are snakes that will do what's called caudal luring. So they will use their tail. They'll bury down in leaf litter or in the sand. It's a death adder in the upper left, and that's a juvenile copperhead in the lower right. And you can see they both have colored tips on their tail. And what they'll do is they'll stick their tail out and they'll wiggle it around, and it looks like an earthworm or a caterpillar or a lizard tail or something that is appetizing to, in this case, they both eat other reptiles. They would come by and then they would use that to bring them in, and then they would strike and consume the prey. In the case of the copperhead, though, this is really a behavior we only see in juveniles. As they get older, that color will fade as they add down the melanin, and they don't tend to do that anymore, and they'll actually start consuming larger prey at that point. So it's probably a way for the younger copperheads to be able to get smaller prey. Let's talk about reproduction here quickly. As I mentioned, not all snakes lay eggs, but most of them do, and we call that oviparity, and that is basically the act of laying a shelled egg. So the embryos develop inside. These are snake eggs, and reptile eggs in general are not very heavily calcified like you get with bird eggs. It's much softer. It's kind of like pushing the palm of your hand below your thumb. They're a little bit squishy. They're generally oval. And as I said, most snakes in the world do lay eggs, and they're very leathery. And what they tend to do is they lay them in moist, warm soil. And so, for example, gopher snakes, probably the most common snake in the West. They lay about 8 to 12 eggs, and they'll do it kind of oftentimes undercover. They'll use their tail to sort of excavate a little bit of an area, and then they'll lay their eggs in there. Sometimes they'll sort of cover them back up if it's not undercover. And again, they're typically laid in midsummer, and they tend to hatch out in fall. And most snakes follow that reproductive pattern where they will mate usually in the late summer and then give birth in the fall. So it's a little bit different from what we think of with a lot of animals. But we do have a lot of snakes that, not nearly as many, but we do have a lot that are live bearers. And that's, there's 2 different methods, maybe not the right term for it, but there's kind of 2 different modes that some snakes have. Some snakes are what we call viviparous, or they use viviparity, and then there are some that are ovoviviparous. And the end result is the same. They're both giving birth to live young. Viviparous snakes are a lot more like placental mammals. They actually have a maternal connection with the developing embryos, whereas ovoviviparous snakes, they tend to develop in a sort of an embryonic membrane that almost is like an egg. And so it's kind of like, you can think of ovovivipary as snakes basically having developing eggs in their body that hatch inside the body, and then the snakes come out. But again, in all instances, they give birth to live young. These are northern water snakes. I like these pictures because I did postgraduate work on some water snakes where we were looking at the efficacy of head starting, and that's where you allow the snakes to give birth in the lab, raise them up to a certain size, and then let them go to look at survivalship in the wild. They do it a lot with sea turtles. And the thought being, of course, that the bigger they are, the better their chance of survival. We had 8 gravid females in the lab. They all gave birth on the same night. And our cages, the openings were too big, and all the snakes got out in the lab. And the way that we got them back was to put a water bowl on the ground and leave it out overnight. And all the snakes kind of came and gathered in that one water bowl. So just kind of a funny story. We also had another incident where rattlesnakes got out, but that's a whole different story. But just a little bit about the cost and benefits and trade-offs of the two. Viviparous taxa, so the ones that lay eggs, they predominated higher latitudes. So the further away you get from the equator, the more likely you are to find snakes that are live bearers. And the reason for that, obviously you're going to have cooler temperatures for incubation. If you're closer to the equator, you're closer to the tropics, when you lay eggs, the temperature is going to be a lot more conducive to the eggs and embryos developing on their own in ambient temperatures. But when it's much cooler, you don't have that option. And so this allows females to select their temperature for gestating. And so what we find is that the gravid females tend to select warmer environments, and they will maintain a higher, more constant body temperature than non-gravid or non-pregnant snakes, or even their egg-laying counterparts in other snake species. So it gives them the flexibility to choose that embryonic development temperature. And these are just some examples. This is you can see it shows how camouflaged they are as well, but you can see a timber rattlesnake coiled up around a clump of sedges, and that's just an adult male. It's very typical habitat, it's shaded. And then this would be where we would find pregnant or gravid females. This is a rock quarry actually, and they would spend a lot of time under rocks or in these big log piles where trees and shrubs had been cleared. And so they would bask, and then if something approached, they would move back into those for safety and shelter. So you might think that would be a great, if they have much more flexibility in choosing, why has it not evolved for all snakes? There certainly are disadvantages. You have reduced mobility, just like in humans. If you're carrying around a developing baby, you're going to weigh a lot more, you're going to have reduced mobility. And as I showed in the previous slide, you have to be able to select for rare resources if you're in an environment that doesn't have openings, canopy openings, for example. So if you're a rainforest snake, you need to find places where trees have fallen down. I used to find these snakes on the edge of campsites quite a bit in hollow logs that had fallen down on the edge of campsites. And so it can put them in places that make them a little bit more likely to be found as well sometimes. It's harder to escape predators, and then it's harder to forage. If you weigh a lot more and you have reduced mobility, it's harder to forage. And there's a lot of papers that refer to gravid snakes as anorexic, and that they kind of stop eating oftentimes when they are gravid. And so there's oftentimes a lot of weight loss. It's harder to go to reproduce in consecutive years because it's a lot more energetically expensive. You typically have a low reproductive output. So definitely disadvantages. Just as an example, a timber rattlesnake, which is clearly a viviparous or a live-bearing snake, they don't reproduce until they're 5 to 9 years old. Timber rattlesnakes, and a lot of rattlesnakes, can actually live to be quite old, 30 plus years. So they delay reproduction because it's very energetically expensive. They have to build up body mass. They only have 5 to 10 young, so they're young and they don't have very many of them. They only reproduce about every 3 years, and that's kind of at best if conditions are really good. And so if you kind of do the math, you can see, if they live in the wild for about 20 years, they may only reproduce 3 or 4 times. And if you're only reproducing and producing 5 to 10 young with each reproductive bout, you can see that their reproductive output is not going to be very high. And in fact, timber rattlesnakes are not doing well in a lot of the states that they're found in. They're actually state endangered species in quite a few states, not federally, but in Indiana and quite a few of the states back east. So now I'm going to talk about, I think, kind of my favorite topic. And I'll spend a little bit of time on this, and I'll move a little bit into venomous snakes, and then I'll start taking some questions here. But I don't like the term aggression. And people ask me all the time, what snakes are aggressive? Is this snake aggressive? Is this one, have you ever seen an aggressive snake? And the answer is generally no. There's only been one in my entire life that I would say even came after me. It was a speckled rattlesnake, and later on I found that there was a hawk on the ground that I think it had a negative encounter before I even got there. So snakes really aren't aggressive. They're not going to go after humans or larger animals, but they are defensive. And The first sort of line of defense when you're a snake, for most snakes anyway, is, and there are exceptions to this, is to be camouflaged. So a lot of snakes, this Perengi's adder on the left-hand side, you see is pushing down in the sand. You have a juvenile timber rattlesnake hanging out underneath a leaf, and then you have a ruffed green snake in the lower right corner blending in with the vegetation. So they don't really want to be found. There are, of course, some snakes that have what we call aposematic coloration, or these bright colors that they give off as warning. Things like coral snakes, it may make them a little more visible, but it's also kind of considered to be a warning. This is an example of extreme camouflage sort of in timber rattlesnakes, and it's hard to see, but if you look on the left-hand side below the greenbrier, the green plant there, you can see a timber rattlesnake coiled up, and then you can see one right at the base of that, on the right-hand side at the base of the small tree. So they're very camouflaged. I used to have people tell me that their horses could sense them, and I even had somebody stop one time as I was recording data on one on a horse, and he was probably 5 feet away from a timber rattlesnake coiled up. And so they clearly the horse was not able to do that. I just got a warning that it says I may be experiencing network connection difficulties. So if I am, please let me know if you guys are having a hard time hearing. But if hiding or camouflage doesn't work, there are definitely things that they will do. And one of them is to bite. And this is what I think most people fear most with snakes is their bite. Most snake bites generally aren't bad because most snakes are not venomous. The vast majority of the world's snakes, I think there's only about 600 species out of the 3,000 that are venomous. But it's never pleasant to be bitten by something with teeth. And then they can discharge their cloacal contents, and so that's basically they're going to poop on you. They also have musk glands at the base of the cloaca as well, and so they can put out a smelly musk scent that's not very pleasant either. I've actually, some snakes seem like they can projectile musk directly at you. I have been processing rattlesnakes and trying to probe them to determine if they were male or female, and had them stick out their musk glands and projectile right into my eyes. So it's not a very pleasant experience. It smells very bad. And then there are some snakes which put on very elaborate defensive displays that I think are pretty cool. So I'm just going to give you some examples. Cobra in the left-hand top left, you can see, flaring out those with the rib bones in there, and of course gives the hood, which is a warning. Next to that, you have a cottonmouth, which people call water moccasins, and they flash the white in their mouth. Then you have a timber rattlesnake on the right there, showing the rattling of the tail, and then you have a black racer to the lower left doing what I call sort of the figure 8 display, which is actually quite terrifying if you have a big black racer doing that, where they sort of hold their head in one position and then move the body in a figure 8. And then some snakes will have bright colors on their bellies or even on their back as a warning. This is a ringneck snake. They are mildly venomous. We do have them here in Utah, but by and large, in order to get bitten by one, you'd have to shove your pinky down its throat and then let it chew on you for a while. Their venom is more designed to kill and disable earthworms and salamanders. So, but my favorite though, if you've ever heard of a hognose snake, there are 2 different kind of species. There's a western and an eastern. And the first thing that these guys do, and they're not venomous. There is some debate if they have a mild venom, but they are not considered to be dangerously venomous at all. They will flare out their neck and look like a cobra and hiss really loudly and oftentimes strike with their mouth closed. If that doesn't work, then they will curl their tail around and they will sort of smear their cloacal contents all over their body. So it smells really bad. So hopefully nothing's going to want to eat it in that instance. And then if that doesn't work, they'll roll over and play dead. And this is a juvenile hognose snake, and you can see it's rolled over onto its back and played dead. It was actually kind of funny when we took these pictures. We put the snake back on the ground and then hid behind a tree, and you can sort of watch the snake lift its head up. If you jump back out from the tree, it would just roll right back over. And also they're toad specialists. They eat toads, and if it has a toad in its belly, oftentimes they will regurgitate the toad as well, which I never like to see them do because it's effort to get food if you're a snake. I'm going to wrap up by talking about venomous snakes, and I'll try to do this relatively quickly. And again, snakes, if a snake has poison glands or venom glands, it's going to be venomous. And there's a difference between venomous and poisonous. A lot of people refer to snakes as poisonous, but they're not. Poison means you have to eat it in order to get sick, and venom is injected through fangs, like syringes. So spiders, snakes, things like that are going to be venomous and not poisonous. And as I mentioned, it has to be injected through fangs, and there's kind of two different main groups. There are more than two, but two main groups of venomous snakes in the world. The cobras on the left are the elapids, and on the right you have vipers or viperids. And there's a difference in their fang structure. On the left, you can see those fangs are considerably smaller. Cobra fangs, the elapids, they're fixed. They're not on kind of hinges. They're not movable at all. They still can deliver venom. But on the right-hand side, you can see vipers. So our rattlesnakes and most of our venomous snakes in the US have these long curved fangs that are mobile. And when the snake opens its mouth, they kind of spring out. And so they can inject that venom much deeper into the tissues. And there's a difference generally in the composition of the venom. So if you're a cobra, you're more likely to have high components of neurotoxin in your venom. And these types of toxins are going to affect things like the nervous system. And if you're a viper, you're generally going to have more hemotoxic types of venom. So you're going to have things like components and enzymes and proteins in there that are going to start breaking down tissues and work more on the circulatory system and muscle tissues than you are in neurotoxins. And then both of these groups there's a lot of overlap. There are certainly cobras with hemotoxins, and there are rattlesnakes and vipers with neurotoxins as well. And then there's these mix of cytotoxins, so things that break down cells, myotoxins, things that break down muscles, and then cardiotoxins, which tend to affect the heart. So there's all kinds of different toxins and concoctions that make up these different types of venoms. But generally speaking, vipers have hemotoxic and cobras have neurotoxic. And as I mentioned, the neurotoxin is going to affect the nervous system and kind of block neurotransmitters and ultimately result in muscle paralysis and respiratory failure. And then hemotoxins are going to cause that tissue destruction. And then there may be loss of blood, and then you're going to get a lot of massive swelling. And so this was just kind of a picture I found online that wasn't too graphic, that sort of shows a lot of the swelling and tissue damage that comes along with a hemotoxic snake bite. Let's talk a little bit about bite statistics here, and then I'm going to wrap up. And so worldwide, there's about 2 million envenomations. And envenomation means the snake bites and injects venom, because snakes can do dry bites. And that results worldwide in about 100,000 deaths and then about 500,000 disabilities. So it's worldwide, it's a huge issue. But here in the United States, it's considerably less. They only treat about 9,000 patients per year, results in only about 2 to 7 deaths per year. And then the vast majority of our envenomations come from the vipers. So rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths. Rattlesnakes predominate, but you also get quite a few bites from copperheads and cottonmouths in the southeastern United States. Coral snakes, which is our only elapid, it's our only cobra here in the United States. There's a few species of them, but it's our only one. Considerably fewer probably than 200. I found 200 in one paper, but I would bet that number to be even lower. Coral snakes do tend to do a lot of dry bites as well. So only about 200 coral snake envenomations, and then we get a handful or quite a few envenomations from people who are keeping exotic snakes. Every state has its own laws on this. Here in Utah, you can't, but a lot of states like Florida and other places in Nevada do allow you to keep venomous snakes, and that does result in quite a few bites from people keeping them. There was this paradigm, or what we used to say the typical victim was, based on data that came out probably pre-2000 or the early 2000s and earlier. The typical victim, and this actually hasn't changed, was somebody who was male. You were typically between 17 and 27, so young. You were generally bitten on the extremities, so arms and legs or hands and feet. And they used to say that most bites came from a deliberate attempt to handle, harm, or kill a snake. And then alcohol intoxication used to be described as a factor in a lot of envenomations. I'm not saying that that wasn't the case back then, but there has been a little bit of a paradigm shift. There was a paper that was put out in 2017 that actually only found that less than 20% of all bites came from intentional interactions. And this may be that we're seeing a lot of people who are getting outside and recreating these days. But you still were seeing 91% of all the intentional bites were male, and all of them were on the upper extremities. And then about half of all the upper extremity bites were from intentional interactions. So still a really bad idea to try and intentionally handle or kill a snake. And we're still seeing it's predominantly male, although it's definitely increased in terms of the number of females that are bitten. So about 70% to 30%. And then, you know, of those, less than 30% of them are going to be younger than 12 years old. And then as far as alcohol is concerned, considerably lower than they used to report. There was a paper in 2018 that, you know, almost 100,000 bites that were looked at, alcohol was a factor in only 608, so less than 1%. But yeah, people who were bitten after using alcohol and drugs were almost 5 times as likely to be male. There was, you were almost 30 times more likely to have to receive antivenom, and you were 31 times more likely to die from the envenomation if alcohol was indeed a factor. And so definitely not something you want to do is drink and play with snakes for sure. I just want to wrap up here quickly, and I'm trying to get done so we have time for a few questions. I do want to talk quickly if you are bitten, and this really does apply mostly to the US, where our snakes are generally going to be vipers and not the elapids or the cobras. The main thing to take home is you need to seek medical attention immediately. If you have a cell phone, you need to call 911. If you're hiking, you need to go to a place where you can call 911. They should be able to tell you what to do, and you need to get yourself to a medical facility to get medical attention. And that really is the only thing that you can do in the United States to really deal with a venomous snake bite. They used to say, you know, you wanted to use an extractor device or a suction device. They used to talk about cutting and sucking. So you would actually cut the bite site and try and suck out the venom. They found all of these methods to actually not work at all, and in fact, cause a lot more damage. You do not want to use constriction devices or pressure bandages because of the massive amount of swelling. In fact, you want to remove any constrictive clothing if you can. If you have rings on your hand and you're bitten on the hand, or you're wearing tight jeans, things like that, you would want to remove that as quickly as you can. They used to talk about using electrocution devices, so like probes that would, that's been disproven. You don't want to, administering antihistamines may not necessarily be a bad thing, but it's certainly not going to help. And you don't want to apply ice to the bite site because you can actually cause some tissue damage doing that. And I just want to quickly note that the antivenoms in the United States are all made kind of in the same way. They're polyvalent antivenoms from multiple snake species. And they are this cocktail basically that will treat almost all the venomous snake bites in the United States, with the exception of coral snakes. So there's not really a need to necessarily even identify the snake. If you can, great, because it may help them know how fast venom symptoms may set in, because some snakes have different venom compositions. But there's no reason to attempt to kill or capture the snake. That usually results in a second bite. I have some good stories on that, but I'm kind of running out of time. So with that, I am going to wrap up. And if there are any questions, I will be happy to entertain as many as we have time for.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, Scott. We do have some questions, so I will go ahead and just get started since we have a couple minutes. Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about the shedding process? About, you know, things like how long does that generally take, or is it does it vary a lot?
It varies a lot. Typically, they're gonna, for about a week prior to shedding, they're gonna have that blue-eyed look to them. So it typically a week to maybe a little bit longer, they're going to have that. And the actual process, though, of shedding can happen pretty rapidly. less than an hour or two if the snake is healthy. I say if they're healthy because sometimes if they're not, or they have a fungal infection and it takes them a lot longer to be able to shed, or they shed more in pieces. So.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. Does a standard rattlesnake venom, work for the Mojave green species of rattler?
So the Mojave green is an interesting one. It's a species. There are actually what they call subpopulation A and subpopulation B, and I can't off the top of my head remember which one's which, but they do have, one of them has a really strong neurotoxin in there. The other one does not. And they're known as probably being one of the more dangerous venomous snakes in the United States because of that high neurotoxin component. Short answer to that is yes, it will. Because it's a polyvalent antivenom, it is produced from snakes that do have a fairly high neurotoxin component as well. It will. There was kind of a common misconception that if you were bitten by a Mojave rattlesnake, you're probably going to die. But that's not bared out to be the truth. So the antivenom will work on Mojave rattlesnakes as well.
Good to know. And along those lines, do most hospitals carry antivenom?
That's an interesting question, and I don't have a real great answer for you. Your best bet would be to check with local hospitals. The answer is no. Not all hospitals are going to carry it. Usually, states with high numbers of venomous snake bites will certainly have venom centers. Here in Utah, most people are transported to the University of Utah. Southern California, there's Loma Linda University has a really good venom treatment center. The reality is a lot of doctors are not trained in treating venomous snake bites. It's more of an art almost than a science. And so it's probably not something that you want to have readily available to everybody because it can be misused. It's relatively safe. It can cause anaphylaxis, but most medical facilities are trained to treat anaphylaxis pretty easily. So the short answer is no, but there should be, if you're in an area with venomous snakes, there probably are places that do carry antivenom. Antivenom also has a fairly low shelf life. It's not something that can be carried around in the field and administered in the field. It needs to be done by a medical professional, and it needs to be stored properly. And it's expensive. And typically, you're going to need a fair number of vials as well. Antivenom, you're probably looking 5 to 10, depending on the manufacturer of vials, and they can run, several $1,000s per vial, not to mention all the hospital fees on top of that.
All right, so avoid getting bitten. All right, I think we have time for one more. So this question is about how people train cobras to perform, and what are the legalities around doing something like that?
Wow, that's going into an area that I don't have a good answer for you. Okay. Legalities is probably going to vary by state. My understanding is there are people who actually do work with cobras and they have not removed venom glands. There are ways to remove fangs and venom glands that are not considered to be very humane. Laws are going to vary dramatically by where you are. I would hesitate to give a good answer just because I don't have one. So I don't want to say something, give misinformation.
I get it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I'll turn it back over to you for some closing comments.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everyone taking the time. Hopefully, this at the minimum has increased in appreciation of snakes. Sort of fear and misunderstanding has really reduced conservation of snake species in a lot of places. So hopefully people will be a little more conscious about the role and value that snakes play in the environment and support projects and support conservation effort to include things like snakes, because a lot of conservation efforts are more geared towards more charismatic species. And even though I think snakes are super charismatic myself, not everybody does. But hopefully people find them interesting. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links at our website, nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone.